She came to Thornleigh Court on the back of a carrier's cart, in the last gray hour before the rain, with everything she owned in one leather travel case, and a small brass key on a faded blue ribbon hidden beneath her collar. And within the hour, the great house had decided what she was: a penniless companion, a nobody, a charity case kept on out of habit, taken in to read aloud and carry shawls and be grateful. She let them believe it. She did not yet know that an old man had died in a narrow room in Bath, with her name sealed in a packet of cream paper, and that the very house, now looking down its marble nose at her, had never, in law, belonged to the family that lived in it. The footman who opened the side door did not take her case. He looked at the dove-gray wool of her dress, plain and clean and many seasons old, and at the worn travel case at her feet, and did the arithmetic that servants in great houses learn to do in a single glance, and stood aside without offering his arm. "You'll be the companion," he said. It was not a question. Behind him, the hall opened into a vault of cold marble, a staircase wide enough to drive a curricle up, ancestral veins glaring down from gilt frames into the gloom, and the first candles of the evening being lit one by a girl on a tall ladder. Marian Aldworth picked up her own case and stepped over the threshold of Thornleigh Court with her chin level, and the great door closed behind her on the last of the daylight. Her name was Marian Aldworth, and she was 23, and she had once expected a very different life. She did not say so. She had learned the great usefulness of not saying so. She had soft hands and a straight back, and an old exact Latin that no governess had ever beaten into her, because her father had taught her himself at the kitchen table of a rented house in Winchester, in the years when there had still been a father. And these things, the hands, the back, the Latin, were the only inheritance anyone could see, and they were precisely the things that made the upper servants distrust her on sight. A real lady would not stoop to be a companion. A real servant would not have hands like that. She was a thing that did not fit, and houses like Thornleigh have no patience with things that do not fit. The housekeeper was a wide, watchful woman of 50, named Mrs. Tilly Burnett, who carried a ring of keys at her waist and a great deal more behind her eyes than she ever let out. She met Marian at the foot of the back stairs with a candle, and looked at her for a long, level moment, and something moved across her face that Marian was too tired to read. "You'll have the blue room at the top," Mrs. Burnett said. "It's small, and it's cold, but it's quiet, and you'll be glad of the quiet in this house." She turned the candle so the light fell on Marian's face. "Eat your supper, Miss Aldworth. You've a thin look. The Dowager keeps long hours, and she'll want you reading by 9. And then, as Marian turned to climb the narrow stair, the housekeeper said one more thing, very low, in a voice not meant to carry. "Your mother had that same straight back." And when Marian turned startled, the woman had already gone. Marian did not sleep that first night. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the cold blue room under the eaves, and she took the brass key from beneath her collar and held it in her palm, the way she always held it before she had to be brave about something. And she looked at it in the light of her one candle. It was a small key, dull with handling, plain, the sort of key that opens nothing grand. A writing box, a tea caddy, a drawer. It opened a rosewood writing box that now stood empty in the corner of the room, its brass corners catching the candlelight, because everything that had once been in it had long since been sold. The key was all she had kept. Her mother had worn it on that same blue ribbon, and her mother's mother before her, and her mother had said, dying, in the small hot room that smelled of camphor and failure, "Keep the key, Marian. Whatever else goes. There is a thing it opens that they cannot take." Marian had been 17. She had thought, in her grief, that her mother meant the box, and the box had been empty, and she had not understood. She still did not understand, but she had kept the key. Thornleigh Court was the seat of Julian Vane, 6th Duke of Harrowby, and it was the finest thing Marian had ever stood inside. And it was not, though no one in it ever said so, his. The Duke's true family seat was Harrowby Hall, 40 miles to the north, an entailed estate bound up tight in the strict settlement that had passed it from eldest son to eldest son for 200 years. Land no duke could sell and no debt could touch. Thornleigh was a different matter entirely. The house, the park, the home farm, every brick and acre of it had been bought outright, in fee simple, 2 generations before, by a man whose money was newer than the Vanes liked and whose name they preferred to forget. And that man had let the family live in it, and they had grown so used to living in it that they had ceased to remember it had ever been bought at all. The law remembered. But the law had been sleeping, sealed in a packet of cream paper in a solicitor's strongbox in Bath, and no one at Thornleigh had any reason to wake it. The Dowager Duchess of Harrowby, Augusta Vane, the Duke's mother, held Thornleigh Court for the term of her natural life and ruled it as though she would hold it forever. She was a tall, dry, upright woman of 61, handsome still in the cold way of women who have never once been crossed, and she required a companion the way she required a fire in her grate and weak tea at 4, as a fixture that should be there and should not speak unless spoken to. Her last 3 companions had not lasted, and Marian understood why before her first week was out. The Dowager did not want company. She wanted an audience that could read aloud, fetch what was wanted, and absorb, without flinching and without leaving, the small, steady cruelties that a bored and powerful woman dispenses to those who cannot answer back. "You read tolerably," the Dowager told her on the 3rd evening, in the tone of one conceding a great deal. "Better than the last girl, who murdered her vowels. Where were you schooled?" Marian set the book down on her knee, keeping her place with one finger. "At home, your grace. By my father." The Dowager's pale eyes moved over her. "And what was your father?" There it was. The question Marian had been asked in every house she had served. The question that decided everything. She had learned to answer it plainly and let them make of it what they would. "He was an officer, your grace." "A captain." "An officer." The Dowager said the word as though picking up something slightly soiled. "And he left you nothing, this captain, that you must read to old women for your bread?" Marian closed her hand once around the brass key beneath her collar, and then she folded her hands again in her lap. "He left me an education, your grace, and a great deal of affection. The rest was lost." "Lost," the Dowager repeated, and lost interest, and waved at the book. "Go on. You stopped at the duel." So Marian read of the duel, and her voice did not shake, and she did not tell the Dowager Duchess of Harrowby that her father, Captain George Aldworth, had been the lawful and only son of the very man who had bought Thornleigh Court, disowned and cut off without a shilling for marrying a woman his father thought beneath him. Marian's mother, Mary Hale, a clergyman's daughter with no fortune, and a beautiful low voice, and a straight back. Nor that Marian herself was, in the cold eye of the law, the legitimate granddaughter of the man whose money had paid for the marble under the Dowager's feet. She did not tell her, because she did not herself fully know it. She knew only fragments. A father who spoke of his own father just once, drunk and weeping, the night the letter came, that he had died. A grandfather she had never met, who had cast her father out, and whom her father had, in turn, refused to forgive. A name, Aldworth, that her father had carried like a wound. She did not know that the quarrel had been mended, in secret, too late, by a dying old man who could not make himself say so to his son's face, and so had said it instead to a solicitor, and a sheet of cream paper, and a disc of black wax. The Duke of Harrowby came down to Thornleigh in the 2nd week of Marian's service, and the whole house changed its weather to suit him. Doors that had stood half shut stood open. The hothouse gave up its fruit. The dowager, who was cold to everyone, became in his presence a fond and anxious mother, displaying her son to himself. Marian, sewing in the window seat of the morning room, looked up when he came in, and looked a moment longer than she meant to. He was a handsome man. She would give him that, even afterward, even when she had every reason in the world to wish him plain. He was tall and dark, with a strong, clean jaw and pale gray eyes set under straight brows, and he carried himself with the unthinking certainty of a man who had never once had to wonder whether a door would open for him. He was, Marian judged, 32, and he looked at her, sitting in the window with the dowager's mending in her lap, exactly as the footman had looked at her on the first night. He saw the gray dress and the work in her hands and the absence of any jewel, and he did the arithmetic, and he looked away. She was furniture. He had already forgotten she was in the room. "Mama," he said, crossing to kiss the dowager's dry cheek. "You look 10 years younger than when I last saw you. Thornleigh agrees with you. It always did." "Thornleigh agrees with everyone, Julian," the dowager said, taking his hand in both of hers. "It is the finest house in the county, and it knows it. Sit. Tell me everything. Tell me about the Crofts." And Marian, in the window, bent her head over the mending and became, as she had taught herself to become, invisible. And she listened, because a companion always listens, and learned in the next quarter of an hour a great deal the Vane family would not have chosen to tell her. The great entailed lands of Harrowby were heavily mortgaged. The 6th Duke had inherited from the 5th not only a title, but a mountain of debt, and the only honorable instrument for moving such a mountain was a rich marriage. There was a Miss Lavinia Croft, only daughter of a Bristol banker whose money was very new and very large. A marriage was as good as arranged, and the dowager, who would have died rather than receive Mr. Croft the banker at her table 10 years before, now spoke of his daughter's £80,000 with the tender reverence of a woman naming her dearest hope. The Duke did not love Miss Croft. It did not, in the smallest degree, signify whether he did. She might have pitied him. A man marrying where he did not love, to save the bones of his ancestors' house, is a man caught in a trap, and Marian had been caught in traps of her own. But he gave her no opening for pity, because he did not see her at all. He asked her name on the 4th day, and forgot it within the hour, and asked it again on the 6th, as though for the first time. She told him both times, in the same level voice, "Aldworth, your grace. Marian Aldworth." The second time he said, "Ah, yes, of course," in the way men say it when they have not the faintest recollection, and he never used the name again that whole visit. She was spoken of, when she was spoken of, as my mother's companion, or once, within her hearing, as the gray little person who reads to Mama. She heard that. She was pouring the dowager's tea when she heard it, and her hand did not shake, and not one drop went over the rim, and she set the cup down at the dowager's elbow and stepped back into the shadow where companions stand. She had decided, somewhere on the long road to Thornleigh, that she would not let these people teach her to think less of herself than her mother had taught her to think. A straight back costs nothing, her mother had said. She kept her back straight. It was the only answer available to her, and she gave it day after day, in silence. The cruelties were small at first, and they were many. The dowager required her to be present at all hours, and to be invisible at all of them. To stand through long dinners against the wall in case a fan was wanted. To sit up reading until 2 in the morning and to be downstairs and bright-eyed by 8. To walk 3 paces behind in the gardens carrying the shawl, the parasol, the smelling salts, the book. Marian carried the dowager's shawl up and down the cold marble stairs of Thornleigh Court 100 times that first month, never once suspecting whose stairs they truly were. And she carried it without complaint, because complaint was a luxury she had sold, along with her mother's brooches and her father's sword, and the rosewood box's contents, one humiliating pawnshop at a time, in the lean years after they died. She had £3 in the world, sewn into the lining of her case. She had no people. She had nowhere to go if Thornleigh turned her out, and so she carried the shawl, and read the books, and folded the small gray things, and held her tongue, and at night she took out the brass key, and held it in her palm, and reminded herself who she was, even if no one else in the world remembered or cared. Mrs. Burnett, the housekeeper, was the one mercy in the house, and even her mercy was guarded and strange. She saw to it that Marion's small fire was lit, which was not in her orders. She had a second helping sent up on the nights the Dowager kept Marion late, and she stopped Marion once in the long gallery, when no one was by, with that same searching, troubled look. And your mother, God rest her, what was her name before she married? Marion, who could not think why the housekeeper should care, answered simply, Hale, Mary Hale. Her father was the rector of a small parish in Hampshire. Mrs. Burnett stood very still. And your father? Captain George Aldworth, of the 43rd. The housekeeper made a small sound, quickly stifled, and turned it into a cough, and busied herself with the keys at her waist. You favor her, she said, not quite steadily. I knew your mother, Miss Aldworth, a long time ago, in another house. And she would say no more. Though Marion asked, she only pressed Marion's hand, once, hard, and walked away down the gallery very fast. Ian Marion was left under the cold portraits of the Vanes, with the strangest sense that she had brushed past a door in the dark without finding the handle. If you have come this far into Marion's story, the loyal old housekeeper of Thornleigh would tell you herself, and she is the only soul in this house who knows what is coming, that you must not look away now, for the part she has waited 11 years to see is very nearly here. Press the small bell beneath this tale and stay by the fire, because what the sealed packet holds will turn this proud house on its head. Mrs. Burnett did not say that, of course. She only refolded a stack of linen that did not need refolding, twice over, the way she always did when her heart was full and her mouth was closed. And she went down to her own room and sat for a while with her hand pressed flat to her breast. The first true blow, the first cruelty that was not small, came at the end of Marion's second month, and it concerned her wages. She was owed a quarter salary, 8 guineas, which was nothing to the house and the whole world to her, and the steward, a thin, sour man named Mr. Pruitt, who answered only to the Duke, told her with evident satisfaction that there was a difficulty. His Grace had given instruction that the household accounts at Thornleigh were to be, he used the word with relish, retrenched. But my wages are not a new expenditure, Mr. Pruitt, Marion said very evenly. They are owed. I have worked the quarter. His Grace considers a companion a discretionary expense, a luxury, as it were. The Dowager could do very well with a maid to read to her, at half the cost. He smiled, showing small teeth. You may take it up with His Grace, if you like. He rides out at 10. She took it up with His Grace. It cost her something. To stand in the path of a man who had never once met her eyes, and to make him see her in the act of asking for money, which is the surest way in the world to confirm a rich man's poor opinion of a poor woman. But she had £3 and no people, and she had worked the quarter. And so at 10 o'clock, she stood at the foot of the great staircase in her gray dress, hands folded, chin level, and waited for the Duke of Harrowby to come down. He came down, drawing on his gloves, talking over his shoulder to a friend, and was halfway across the marble before he registered that there was a person in his way who did not move. He stopped. He looked at her. Actually, looked, perhaps, for the first time. Yes, he said. What is it? Your Grace, Marion said. I am Marion Aldworth, your mother's companion. I am owed a quarter's wages, 8 guineas. I have been told there's a difficulty, and that I must apply to you. For a moment the Duke seemed simply not to comprehend, not the words, but the event of being addressed on his own staircase by his mother's companion about money. His brows drew together. You are asking me for money, he said slowly. On my staircase. I am asking you for my wages, your Grace, she said, which I have earned. Something cold and amused came into his face, the expression of a man who has decided to be diverted rather than annoyed. "Do you know," he said, "I find I cannot even recall your name. My mother's companions come and go like the seasons. You will forgive me if I do not learn each one." "Aldworth," she said. "Marian Aldworth. I have told you twice before." "Have you?" He drew his second glove on, smoothing it over his knuckles, not hurrying, making her wait, making her stand there in the act of asking. "Well, Miss Aldworth, I will tell you what I told my steward. The household is retrenching. A companion is not a necessity. If you find the terms of your service unsatisfactory, the world is wide and full of old women who want reading to. I shall not detain you, and I shall not, I think, miss you." And he stepped around her, as one steps around a puddle, and went out to his horse, and left her standing at the foot of the staircase in the cold marble hall of the house that, though neither of them knew it, would one day be hers. She did not weep. She went back up the narrow stair to the coal blue room, shut the door, took out the brass key and held it so hard the wards of it printed red into her palm, and sat very still until the trembling passed, because she would not give this house the satisfaction of her tears, not even alone. And then she did a thing she had not done in 6 years. She took out the single letter she still possessed in her father's hand, written to her when she was small, and he away with his regiment, folded so long it had gone soft as cloth at the creases, and read it, not for what it said, which she knew by heart, but for the look of the writing, the strong, upright hand, the way he had signed it, "Your loving father, G. Aldworth." And beneath the signature, faded almost to nothing, she found again the thing she had noticed as a child and never thought to wonder at, a small device he had sometimes drawn for her amusement, a tiny crest, a hawk on a glove. She had thought it a doodle. She traced it now with one finger. She did not know it was the crest of the Aldworths of Thornleigh, granted her grandfather when his money bought him the right to a coat of arms. She only knew her father had drawn it, and that it was hers in some way she could not name, and she folded the letter away and went down to read to the Dowager as though nothing at all had happened. Miss Lavinia Croft arrived at Thornleigh in October, with her father and 2 maids, and a great deal of luggage, and the settled intention of becoming a duchess. And from the moment her foot touched the marble of the entrance hall, the small, steady cruelties that Marian had endured took on a sharper and more deliberate edge. Miss Croft was a glossy, high-colored young woman of 20, with a quantity of fair hair and a quantity of new jewels, and a way of looking at a room as though pricing it. There was something in her that curdled the moment she was crossed, and she understood within a day exactly what Marian was, and exactly how much pleasure was to be had in reminding her of it. For a woman about to be very grand finds it useful to have near at hand someone demonstrably not grand at all, against whom her own grandeur may be measured. And Miss Croft chose Marian for the office, and filled it with energy. It began with small things. Miss Croft would send Marian on errands that were no part of her duties, to fetch a dropped handkerchief from across the house, to wait outside a door in case she should be wanted, and then to be told an hour later that she was not wanted after all. She corrected Marian's curtsy in front of the room. She remarked to the Dowager on the shabbiness of the companion's dress, and wondered aloud, sweetly, that the family should be served by someone so very threadbare. And once, at the dinner table, before 8 guests, she asked Marian where she had bought her gown. And when Marian answered quietly that it had been her mother's, made over, Miss Croft laughed, a bright social laugh, and said, "How affecting! The poor Duke contrived so cleverly." And the table laughed with her, because the table always laughs with the future Duchess. And the Duke of Harrowby, at the head of it, did not laugh, but neither did he stop it, and his silence was its own kind of laughter. And Marian, standing against the wall where companions stand, kept her chin level, and gave them not one flicker of what it cost. but she was watched, in those weeks, by more than the malice of Miss Croft. The Duke's younger sister, Lady Harriet Vane, came to Thornleigh for the autumn, 19, plain and kind and clever, with none of her brother's beauty, and a great deal more of his late father's heart, and alone of all the Vanes a person of conscience. She saw the way the companion was used, and who sent her on the cruel errands, and who laughed at the made-over gown. And one wet afternoon, finding Marian in the library, for Marian, when the Dowager slept, would steal an hour among the books, the one undiminished pleasure left to her, Lady Harriet sat down across from her, and said, without preamble, "I am ashamed of how you are treated in this house, Miss Aldworth. I want you to know that not all of us are blind." It had been so long since anyone in that house had spoken to her as one person speaks to another, that for a moment Marian could not answer. "You are very kind, my lady." "I am not kind," Lady Harriet said. "Kind would be doing something, and I have not the power to do anything. My brother does not heed me, and my mother heeds me less. But I can at least refuse to pretend I do not see. You are not what they say you are. I do not know what you are, but you are not that." It was Lady Harriet who first wondered aloud about the brass key. She saw it one afternoon when Marian leaned to retrieve a fallen book, and the ribbon swung free of her collar. "What a curious little key! What does it open?" And Marian, closing her hand around it from old habit, said, "A writing box that is empty, my lady. It was my mother's. It opens nothing of any worth now." "Then why do you wear it?" Marian was quiet a moment. "Because she told me to. Whatever else goes," she said, "there is a thing it opens that they cannot take." She gave a small, rueful smile. I have never understood her. The box is empty, but I keep the key. Lady Harriet looked at the small, dull key for a long moment, and something thoughtful crossed her plain face, and she did not laugh, as Miss Croft would have laughed. "Perhaps she did not mean the box," she said slowly. "My old nurse used to say that the last words of the dying are seldom about furniture." And then a bell rang somewhere in the house, and Marian rose to answer it, but the words stayed with her, turning over in the dark of the blue room that night. Perhaps she did not mean the box. The autumn deepened toward winter. The marriage was settled in earnest, and a great ball was planned at Thornleigh for the announcement of the engagement, and into the bright, hard machinery of those preparations, Marian was caught up like grit in a clock. There were 1,000 things wanting doing, and 100 fewer servants than tasks, the household having been retrenched into a skeleton, and so the companion, the cheapest pair of hands in the house, and the one least able to refuse, was set to labor far below even the menial. She wrote out the invitations in her clear hand, 240 of them, until her fingers cramped. She sat up 3 nights retrimming the Dowager's old gowns to a newer fashion, because the Dowager would not spend on new, and would not be outshone at her son's engagement. And on the morning of the ball itself, she was sent down to the servants' hall to help the kitchen, and stood at a scrubbed deal table among the scullery maids, plucking pheasants with her soft, ruined hands. And one of the kitchen girls, a kind, rough creature named Bess, looked at those hands and said, "Lo, you weren't never bred to this, miss. Anyone can see. What did you do to come down so far?" And Marian, plucking the pheasant, said, "Nothing, Bess. I did nothing at all. It was done to me." Which was, she reflected, the whole truth of her life, in a single sentence. The night of the ball, Thornleigh Court blazed. Every candle in the house was lit. The great rooms threw open their doors. 240 of the county's best came up the marble staircase in silken diamonds to drink the Duke's champagne and crane, to see the banker's daughter who had bought herself a coronet. Marian was not a guest. In her made-over gray, she stood in the shadow of a pillar at the edge of the ballroom, in case the Dowager should want her. A station precisely calculated to let her watch every glittering minute of a world that had once been meant to be hers, and would never be hers now. She watched the Duke lead Miss Croft out in the first dance, the two of them gold and white under 1,000 candles, and she felt not envy, which she had cured herself of years before, but a great, quiet distance, as though she were looking at the lit windows of a house from very far off in the cold. And then the engagement was announced. The Duke stood at the head of the room with Miss Croft's hand in his, and his mother glowing beside him, and made the small, graceful speech that such occasions require, and the room lifted its glasses, and Miss Croft, flushed with triumph and champagne and the full sweet sense of her own arrival, did a thing she had perhaps not planned, and could not afterward unsay. Her eye, sweeping the admiring room, fell on Marian in the shadow of her pillar, the one person not applauding, the gray reminder of everything Miss Croft had risen above, and she was seized by the desire to be cruel before 240 witnesses, which is a desire that visits small, triumphant people at exactly such moments. She raised her glass a little higher, and said, in a voice pitched bright and clear to Carrie, "And let us not forget those who serve us. To the help of this house." She let her eyes rest, smiling on Marian, "who keep their place so very nicely, and ask for nothing they have not earned." And the room, not knowing quite what was meant, but knowing a witticism when the future Duchess made one, laughed, and a few faces turned to follow her gaze, and found the gray companion by the pillar, and laughed a little more, and Marian Aldworth stood in the full light of 240 pairs of eyes, and was made, for one long calculated moment, the public joke of the Duke of Harrowby's engagement ball. She did not run, she did not flush, or look down, or give them the satisfaction of a single visible wound. She let her gaze travel, slow and level, across the laughing room, across Miss Croft's bright, triumphant face, the Dowager's thin, amused mouth, and the Duke of Harrowby, who was not laughing, who watched her with an expression she could not read and did not try to. And then she made the room a curtsy. It was a perfect curtsy, the curtsy of a woman taught by people who had been received at court, deep and exact, and entirely without servility, the kind that says, "I honor the form, and despise the use you have made of it." And she rose from it, with her chin level, and her eyes dry, and turned, and walked out of the ballroom of Thornleigh Court through the laughing crowd with a straight back, and the candle roar of the ball burned at her back, and she did not once look round. It was the Duke who could not, afterward, forget it, and Marian did not learn of it for a long while, and would not have believed it if she had. Something in the practiced certainty of that curtsy, the depth of it, the breeding in it, had lodged in him like a splinter under the skin. He knew that curtsy. He had seen it made, just so, by duchesses and the daughters of earls. He had never once seen it made by a hired companion, because that curtsy is not a thing one learns in service. It is a thing one learns in a nursery with a dancing master, and a mother who was herself received at St. James's. He stood in the wreck of his own engagement ball with his bride's hand cold in his, and watched the door close behind a gray woman whose name he could not reliably remember, and thought, against every instinct of his rank, who taught her to do that? And the question would not leave him. He began, after that night, to be present in rooms Marian was in, not to speak to her, for the social fact that would license speech still did not exist, but to observe her, with the careful detachment of a man examining a thing that does not add up. He listened when she read to his mother, not to the book, but to the reading, to the unhurried, educated cadence of it, and the easy Latin tags she rendered without stumbling. He came upon her once in the library, a book open on her knee, and she rose at once to leave, as a servant must when the master enters. And he said, "What are you reading?" Not gently, but as a kind of test, and she told him, and it was Greek. And when he raised a skeptical brow, she translated the line she had been reading, plainly, without showing off, and then she curtsied and left him alone with the splinter driven a little deeper. Companions did not read Greek. Nobody's daughters were not taught Greek, and yet here was one, reading Greek, in his library, with the hands of a lady and the curtsy of a duchess, and a name he kept forgetting, because he had decided, on the first day, that she was no one, and could not now make the decision come undone. What he felt in those weeks he did not examine, because to examine it would have been to question the whole architecture of his life. He was on the eve of marrying £80,000 he did not love, and the last thing he could afford was to find himself thinking about his mother's penniless companion. So he called it a curiosity, a small mystery that pricked his pride, and he did not yet understand that it had begun the night she curtsied to the room that mocked her and walked out unbowed, and would not stop until he had done her a far greater wrong than forgetting her name, and then, too late, undone it. The final cruelty came in December, a fortnight before the wedding, and it came from Miss Croft, and it was the kind of lie that small, frightened people tell when they sense, without understanding why, that they are not as secure as they wish to be. For Miss Croft had begun to notice what the Duke himself had not admitted, that his eye went, more often than was comfortable, to the gray woman in the shadows, that he had asked once, idly, whether the companion was to be kept on after the marriage, and had seemed not quite indifferent to the answer. Miss Croft was not a clever woman, but she was a jealous one, and jealousy has a low cunning all its own, and she resolved to be rid of Marian Aldworth before she was Duchess, and she chose the surest method known to her kind, which is to make the inconvenient woman a thief. A ring went missing, Miss Croft's own ring, a garnet set in gold of no great value, gone from her dressing table on a morning when Marian had been sent up by Miss Croft herself to fetch a shawl from that very room. That afternoon, Miss Croft discovered the loss, loudly, and wept becomingly, and let it be understood without quite saying it that the only person who had been in her room was the companion. And a search was made, with Marian standing white and still in the center of it, and the garnet ring was found, of course it was found, tucked into the lining of Marian's own travel case, beside the £3 and the soft-folded letter and the empty rosewood box. Marian looked at the ring in the searcher's hand, and at Miss Croft's face, which could not quite keep its triumph decent, and she understood the whole of it in an instant, and knew, with the cold clarity of the trapped, that there was no defense. The word of a companion against the word of the future Duchess of Harrowby. There had never been a contest. The Duke was sent for. He came up to the morning room, where Marian stood between two footmen, like the criminal they had decided she was, with the garnet ring on the table before them all, Miss Croft tearful and vindicated by the fire, and the Dowager rigid with the outrage of a woman who has had a viper warming at her hearth. "Well," the Duke said, and looked at the ring, and looked at Marian, and here was the moment. Marian would think of it often afterward, when a man of any discernment, who had watched her these 2 months, and felt the splinter of her under his skin, might have paused, might have wondered why a woman who read Greek and curtsied like a duchess, and had never given the smallest cause for complaint, should suddenly turn common thief over a garnet ring worth less than she was owed in wages. A better man would have wondered. The Duke of Harrowby did not. He was tired, and getting married in a fortnight, and his bride was weeping, and his mother outraged, and the path of least resistance ran straight through the gray woman who had always, somehow, made him uncomfortable, and so he took it. "I confess," he said in a cold, flat voice, "I am not surprised. I never trusted the look of you." He did not even, Marian noted with a kind of distant clarity, address her by the name he could never remember. "You will leave this house within the hour. You will be given no character, and you will be fortunate, exceedingly fortunate, that we do not call in the magistrate. My mother took you in out of charity, and you have repaid her with theft. Get your things and get out." Marian stood very still. She looked at the handsome, cold, certain face of the Duke of Harrowby, and for the first and only time in 2 months, she let him see something in her gray eyes, not fear, and not pleading, but a deep, level, unanswerable contempt. "I did not take the ring, Your Grace," she said quietly, "but I see there is no purpose in saying so, and I will not beg. I will go." and she closed her hand, once, around the brass key at her throat, and turned, and went up to the blue room and packed her case, while a footman stood in the doorway to see she stole nothing more. And then she carried her own case down the back stairs of Thornleigh Court for the last time, and out the side door by which she had come, into the December dark. It was raining. Of course it was raining. She stood on the gravel sweep before the great lit house, with her case at her feet, and the cold rain soaking slowly through her shawl. And behind her, every window of Thornleigh blazed warm and golden with the candles of a house at its dinner, the house that had used her and lied about her, and cast her out without a character into the winter night. And she had nowhere to go, and £3, and no people, and the carrier did not come till morning. And Marian Aldworth stood in the rain with her chin level and her back straight, and she did not weep, and she put her hand to the brass key at her throat, and said aloud, very softly, to her mother who was 11 years dead, "There is a thing it opens that they cannot take. I have kept the key, Mamma. I do not know what you meant, but I have kept it." And then she picked up her case and turned her back on the warm lying windows of Thornleigh Court, and walked away down the long, dark drive into the rain. She did not get far. She had gone perhaps a quarter-mile, to where the drive curved under the great bare beeches, and the lights of the house were lost behind her, when she heard over the hiss of the rain the sound of running feet, and a lantern bobbed behind her, and a voice called her name. Her whole name. "Miss Aldworth! Miss Aldworth! Wait!" And she turned, and it was Mrs. Burnett, bareheaded in the rain, running down the drive after her as fast as her 50 years would let her. "You'll not walk to the village in this," Mrs. Burnett gasped, the rain streaming down her wide, kind face. "You'll come to my sister's this night and be dry and fed. And tomorrow—" She stopped. She set the lantern down on the wet gravel and took Marian by both shoulders and looked at her in the swinging light with an expression Marian had never seen on her, the expression of someone who has carried a great weight a very long way and has decided, at last, to set it down. "Tomorrow," said Mrs. Burnett, "I'll do a thing I should have done years ago. There's a thing I know, Miss Aldworth, a thing about who you are. I've known it since the night you came, and I saw your mother's back on you, and I held my tongue. God forgive me, because it wasn't my place, and I was afraid for my situation. But they've turned you out into the rain on a lie, and I'll hold my tongue no longer. Come with me. Come out of the rain, and let me tell you about your grandfather." The housekeeper's sister kept a clean, small cottage at the edge of the village, and there, before a fire of sea coal, in dry clothes too big for her, with a cup of hot milk going cold in her hands because she had forgotten to drink it, Marian Aldworth heard at last the shape of the thing she had carried all her life, without knowing its name. Mrs. Burnett sat across from her with her hands folded hard in her lap and told it plainly, in the order she had lived it, sparing herself nothing. "I was a young woman in service in Bath," she said, "near 30 years gone, in the house of a Mr. Crispin Aldworth, a rich man, a hard man, who'd made a great fortune in the East India trade, and bought himself land and a coat of arms, and meant his only son to marry it all up into the nobility. And his son, your father, Captain George Aldworth, fell in love, against every plan his father had laid, with a portionless clergyman's daughter named Mary Hale, companion to an old lady 2 doors down, the sweetest, straightest, best bred without a penny young woman I ever knew. I carried notes between them. I stood up with your mother in the little church at Walcott when they married, in the November of the year, with the rain coming down just as it's coming down tonight, because old Mr. Aldworth would not give his blessing, and they would not be parted, and they were lawfully wed, with the banns read and the register signed, and the parson's hand on the book. I saw it done. I made my mark as a witness. I'd swear it on any Bible you put before me. Mrs. Burnett's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "And old Mr. Aldworth cast his son off for it, cut him off without a shilling, struck his name from the family, swore he'd die before he'd own a clergyman's grandchild. And your father, God keep him, was as proud as the old man, and never went back, not when the money ran out, not when he was sent abroad, not when your mother—" She stopped and pressed her lips together. "And so you were born, Miss Aldworth, the lawful and only grandchild of one of the richest men in the west of England, in a rented house, with nothing, because two proud men could not unbend." Marian sat very still. The fire ticked. The rain ran down the small, dark window. "He is dead," she said at last. "My grandfather. My father had a letter, years ago, that he was dead." "He is dead," Mrs. Burnett agreed. "He died near 12 years gone, in Bath. And that is the heart of it, miss. That is the thing I came running down the drive in the rain to say, because I've carried it since and never dared." She leaned forward, the firelight on her face. "I'd left his service by then, but I'd a friend still in the house, a woman I trusted, and she wrote me what passed at the end, for I'd always asked after the old man, having loved your mother so. And what passed at the end was this." He softened, Miss Aldworth. "At the very last, when he was dying, the hardness went out of him, the way it does out of the worst of them, sometimes when the dark comes close. And he was sorry. He was bitterly, uselessly sorry, for the son he'd cast off and could not now call back, for the boy was abroad and unreachable, and the old man too proud, even on his deathbed, to be the first to write. But he could not die easy with it on him. And so he did the only thing a proud man can do who is too proud to say he is sorry to a living soul. He sent for his solicitor, and he made a will." "A will," Marian said. "A will," said Mrs. Burnett. "My friend who was in the house saw the solicitor come, and saw the old man sit up in his bed, and put his seal to a packet of papers with his own hand. And the door being ajar, she heard him say to the lawyer, 'It is to go to my son, and if my son will not have it, to his lawful issue, and to no one else in this world. And you are to keep it sealed, until the day it is asked for, by a court or a vane.' Those were near his words, as near as she could give them me. And I never forgot them, the lawful issue, and to no one else, because I knew even then who his lawful issue was. It was you, a little girl in a rented house in Winchester. You." Mrs. Burnett sat back. "But I was a housekeeper with my own bread to earn, and no proof in my hand, only a friend's letter and the memory of a wedding I'd witnessed. And what was I to do? Walk up to the Aldworth lawyers and say, 'I know where the heir is'? They'd have laughed me from the door. And then your father died abroad, and your mother of grief, and want not 2 years after. And you vanished into service, and I lost the thread of you, and thought the moment passed. And then you came up the back stairs of Thornleigh in a gray dress with your mother's straight back, and I near dropped my candle. And I held my tongue 2 months more, for fear of my place, while they used you, and called you a thief, and put you out in the rain. And tonight I am done holding my tongue." "But the will was sealed," Marian said slowly, working it through, the trained exactness of her mind taking hold of it even through the storm of feeling. "You said the old gentleman was to keep it sealed until it was asked for by a court, or a vane. Mrs. Burnett, what has the will to do with Thornleigh? With the Vanes? My grandfather lived in Bath. He left his money to his son. What has any of it to do with this house?" And Mrs. Burnett looked at her, and a slow, strange light came into the housekeeper's tired face, the light of a woman watching another walk up to a closed door in the dark and find, at last, the handle. "Why, Miss Aldworth," she said softly, "did you never wonder why an old India trader's will should have to wait upon the asking of a vane? Thornleigh Court was never the Vanes to give nor sell. They only ever lived in it. It was your grandfather who bought it, the house and the park, and the home farm, in fee simple, outright, near 40 years gone, and he settled the use of it on the old Duke's family for the Dowager's lifetime, out of a kind of vanity, to have a Duke beholden to him. But the freehold, the true ownership of every brick, he kept, and willed it in that sealed packet, with all the rest of his fortune, to his lawful issue, and to no one else in this world. They have been living, these 11 years, in your house. The Dowager who works you like a drudge is your tenant. The Duke who put you out in the rain tonight has not, in the eye of the law, the smallest right to so much as a candle in it. It is yours. It was always yours. You have carried that woman's shawl up and down your own staircase for 2 months, and slept in your own house as a servant, and they turned you out of your own front door into the rain, and the proof of it has been sitting sealed in a strong box in Bath for 11 years, waiting for someone to ask. The fire ticked. The rain ran down the window, and Marian Aldworth sat very still in the borrowed chair, with the cold milk in her hands and the brass key at her throat, and did not move and did not speak for a long moment. And then she set down the cup and lifted her hand and closed it around the brass key, and heard her mother's voice across 11 years, across the camphor and the failure and the small hot room, as clear as if Mary Aldworth were standing in the firelight. Keep the key, Marian. Whatever else goes. There is a thing it opens that they cannot take. And all at once she understood. Not the box. Her mother had never meant the box. Her mother had meant the truth of who they were, the thing that could be hidden, and starved, and lied about, and cast out into the rain, but never, by any cruelty of any duke, actually taken away, because it was written in a register in a little church at Walcott in her mother's own married name, and sealed in black wax in a strong box in Bath, and it was hers. Mrs. Burnett, Marian said, and her voice was very steady and very low, and had in it something that had not been there an hour before. How do I find the solicitor? It took 11 days, and the last of Marian's £3 and a loan of 2 more from Mrs. Burnett's sister that she swore on the brass key to repay, and a journey by the public coach to Bath in the bitter cold of late December. But it was not, in the end, a difficult thing to do, because the truth, once it consents to be looked for, is patient and leaves a trail. The wedding of the Duke of Harrowby was on the 2nd of January. Marian reached Bath on the 28th of December, and in a narrow, fire-warmed office, above a shop in a Bath side street, she found the firm of Callaway and Sons, and was shown in to Mr. Josiah Callaway, son of the old gentleman who had drawn Crispin Aldworth's will, now himself an old gentleman of 70, who, when he heard her name, had to set down his pen and sit very still for a full minute before he could trust himself to speak. He was a small, neat, precise man, with white hair and gold spectacles, and a habit, when he was moved, of taking off the spectacles and polishing them very slowly with a square of yellow silk before he said anything that mattered. He did it now, while he looked at her, and only when they were clean did he say, in a careful, dry voice, "Forgive me. I must be certain. You say you are the daughter of Captain George Aldworth, late of the 43rd Foot, and of Mary, his wife, formerly Mary Hale." "I am, sir." "And your father, he is—" "Dead, sir. 11 years. He died abroad. My mother died 2 years after him." Mr. Callaway closed his eyes briefly. "I am very sorry. I never met your father. My own father spoke of him, often with great regret." He set the spectacles back on his nose and looked at her through them with a new and steady attention. "But can you prove it, Miss Aldworth? You understand, I cannot act on a likeness and a name. The estate I have the honor to represent is a very great one, and over the years, 3 persons, none of them genuine, have come to this office, claiming to be the heir. I sent them all away. I will need proof." Marian had thought hard, on the long, cold coach to Bath, about exactly what proof she had, and she gave it to him in order, plainly, as her father might have given a report. "I have my parents' marriage lines, sir, and the entry stands in the register of the Church of St. Swithin at Walcott, where they were wed in the November of the year, with the banns read 3 Sundays and 2 witnesses to the book, one of whom, a woman then called Tilly Marsh, and now Mrs. Burnett, housekeeper at Thornleigh Court, is living, and will swear to it, and saw me born besides. I have my own certificate of baptism, in the same parish, naming both my parents as wed. I have my father's commission, and letters in his hand, and his seal ring with the hawk on a glove that I am told is the Aldworth crest." She drew breath. "And I have this." And she lifted the faded blue ribbon over her head, and set the small brass key down on the green leather of Mr. Calloway's desk, between them, in the lamplight. "It was my mother's, and her mother's. I have worn it 11 years. I do not know what it opens. My mother said, dying, that it opened a thing they could not take. I have always thought she meant only the truth. But you knew my grandfather, sir, and have his papers. I had hoped—" She stopped and steadied herself. "I had hoped you might know whether it opens anything more than that." Mr. Calloway looked at the small brass key on the green leather a long moment, and then he rose, without a word, went to a great iron strong-box in the corner, unlocked it with a key from his own watch-chain, and took from it a flat box of polished rosewood with brass corners, the exact twin of the empty box that had stood all Marian's life in the corner of every cold room she had ever slept in, and set it on the desk beside its sister key, and said, in a voice gone suddenly unsteady for all its dryness, "Your grandfather had 2 made, Miss Aldworth, by the same hand, with the same lock and 2 keys to fit. He gave 1 box and 1 key to your father on the day he was christened, before all the trouble, when the boy was still the apple of his eye, and the other he kept by him to his death, and charged my father to keep it sealed, and my father charged me. I have had it in that strong box 11 years. I never opened it, for it was not mine to open, and the 1 key I held would not, by his design, turn the lock alone." He looked up at her, his old eyes bright behind the gold spectacles. "It wants 2 keys, Miss Aldworth, his and your father's. The lock will not give to one. He made it so that no one might open it who could not bring the other half home. The other half is round your neck. It has been round your neck for 11 years. He drew a long breath. "Will you do me the honor of opening your grandfather's box?" And Marian Aldworth, with her hand not quite steady, took up the small brass key that her mother had worn, and her mother's mother before her, the key she had kept when everything else was sold, the key she had held to her throat in the rain on the night a duke put her out of her own house, and Mr. Calloway turned his key, and she turned hers, the 2 of them together, and the lock of the rosewood box gave with a small old click, and the lid came up, and inside, on a bed of faded blue silk, lay a folded packet of cream-laid paper, gone a little soft and foxed at the edges with the years, closed with a great disk of black sealing wax into which was pressed, deep and clear, the device of a hawk upon a glove, the will of Crispin Aldworth, sealed 11 years, and tucked into the ribbon that bound it, dry and brown and whole, a single sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, that an old dying man had laid there with his own hand for a grandchild he had never been permitted to meet. Mr. Calloway read the will aloud that evening, in the careful, dry voice of his profession, with Marian sitting very straight across the desk and the lamp burning low, and it was exactly, in its dry legal way, the thing Mrs. Burnett had promised in the firelight, and it left no room at all for doubt or quibble. It was properly drawn, witnessed by 2 clerks of the firm, signed and sealed by Crispin Aldworth of Bath, merchant, being of sound mind, and it left his entire personal fortune, which Mr. Calloway, polishing his spectacles, named at a figure Marian had to ask him to repeat, because no sum she had ever heard spoken aloud had been within 100th part of it, and separately and by name, the freehold of Thornleigh Court itself, to my son George Aldworth, and failing him to the lawful issue of his body, and to no other person whatsoever, the veins to hold the house for the present dowager's life, and not one day beyond. And at the foot, in the old man's own added hand, stood a single clause that was not legal language at all, but the one human thing in the document, which Mr. Calloway read twice. And I charge my heir to be a kinder master of that house than I was a father in it. The proof was a register and 2 witnesses and a baptism and a will and 2 keys, and there was, in the whole of it, nothing whatever that any court in England would not uphold in an afternoon. "It is yours, Miss Aldworth," Mr. Calloway said, when he had finished, and folded the paper and set it down. "The money, upon proof of identity, which we shall accomplish within the week, the marriage lines, your witness, your baptism. It is the clearest case I have handled in 40 years, and Thornleigh is yours absolutely upon the death of the present dowager, and yours to administer and draw the rents of now, for she holds only a life interest, and the freehold has been yours in strict law since the hour your grandfather died. They have lived there 11 years on your sufferance, and never knew it, because no one ever asked." He took off his spectacles and polished them, slowly, and there was something almost like a smile in his dry old face. "You came to me with £5 and a borrowed cloak. You will leave a very great heiress. And the landlord, I choose the word with care, of the Duke of Harrowby." "What?" he asked, setting the spectacles back on his nose. "Would you have me do?" Marian sat for a long time, with the will folded on the desk before her, and the brass key, returned now to its ribbon, warm again in her hand. She thought of the cold blue room under the eaves, and the shawl carried up and down the marble stairs, and a perfect curtsy made to a room that mocked her. She thought of a garnet ring tucked into the lining of her case, and a cold flat voice saying, "Get your things and get out," and the rain on the gravel sweep with the warm lying windows at her back. She closed her hand around the key. A straight back cost nothing, her mother had said, but it had cost, in the end, everything. And now, 11 years late, it was being paid back to her in full, with interest, in the one coin the veins had taught her to value above all others, which was not money, but the simple, unanswerable public truth of who she was. "The wedding is on the 2nd of January, she said at last, in her low, clear voice. "At Thornleigh. There will be a great company there. The same company, I should think, that laughed at me at the engagement ball. I should like, Mr. Calloway, for the truth to be told to them, not in a letter, not by a lawyer's clerk at a side door. I should like to come back to that house where I carried the shawl and was called a thief and was put out in the rain, and I should like the proof of who I am to be read aloud, by you, before the very people who watch them shame me. I do not want vengeance, sir. I am not a vengeful woman. My mother did not raise one. But I have been made, in that house, before that company, into a small, gray nothing. And I find I should like, just once, to be made true before them instead. Will you come with me to a wedding?" Mr. Calloway looked at her for a moment, and then the old solicitor rose, and he made her a bow. A deep, exact, entirely serious bow. "The bow one makes to the head of a great house." And he said, "Miss Aldworth, in 40 years at this desk, I have read a great many wills, and watched a great deal of money change a great many hands, and I have learned that money, of itself, mends nothing. But this," he touched the folded will, "this is not money. This is your name, given back to you. I should be honored to read it aloud at Thornleigh Court. I shall bring the register, and the baptism, and a clerk to swear the witness, and I shall wear my best coat." And then he hesitated, and added, with the careful dryness of his kind, I would observe only that the Duke of Harrowby is about to marry 80,000 pounds he does not love, to save an entailed estate that is mortgaged to the roof. He is marrying for money, Miss Aldworth, because he believes himself a poor man with a great house. He is about to learn, before all his guests, that he is a far poorer man than he knew, in a house that was never his, and that the woman he put out in the rain holds his future in her hand. I do not say it to make you cruel. I say it only so that you may go in with your eyes open. The truth you mean to tell will fall on that room like a roof coming in. I know it, sir, said Marian quietly. I have lived under that roof. Let it fall. The 2nd of January came clear and cold, with a hard bright frost lying white over the Thornleigh Park, and the bare beaches black against a pale sky, and the great house was dressed for a wedding. The same 240 came up the marble staircase that had laughed at her in October. The same candles blazed. The Dowager stood in gray and silver triumph at the head of the long drawing room. And the Duke of Harrowby waited at the front of the company in his wedding clothes, pale and handsome, and grimly composed, with Miss Lavinia Croft beside him, in white satin, and the 80,000 pounds worth of diamonds her father had hung on her like a verdict. The clergyman opened his book, and it was at that moment, exactly that moment, for Marian had timed it with Mr. Calloway down to the quarter hour, having no wish to disrupt a sacrament, but every wish to be heard before one was made, that the great doors at the foot of the drawing-room opened, and a footman, looking deeply confused, announced into the expectant hush, Mr. Josiah Calloway, of Bath, solicitor, and Miss Marian Aldworth. The room turned. 240 heads turned, in a long silken rustle toward the doors, and there, where the gray companion had so lately curtsied to their laughter and walked out unbowed, stood Marian Aldworth, but not the Marian they remembered. She had spent a small part of what was now, beyond any doubt, her own money, and she had spent it not on diamonds, but on plainness done perfectly. A gown of deep slate-gray silk, beautifully cut, severe, without a single jewel save the small brass key on its faded blue ribbon at her throat, which she had chosen to wear in the open at last, for all of them to see, and none of them to understand. And she stood in the doorway of the house that was hers, with her chin level and her back straight, and beside her a neat, white-haired solicitor in his best coat, with a flat, rosewood box under his arm. And she looked down the length of the room at the company that had shamed her, and she did not smile, and she did not weep, and she waited, in a silence that stretched and stretched, for them to understand that the world had just changed under their feet, and they did not yet know it. It was the Dowager who broke first. "What," she said, in a voice gone shrill with outrage, "is the meaning of this? That woman is a thief and a discharged servant. Remove her. Julian, have her removed." And 2 footmen started forward, uncertainly, the same 2 who had searched her case in October. And Mr. Calloway stepped a single pace in front of Marian, small and neat, and entirely unafraid, and said, in the dry, carrying voice of a man who has spent 40 years being believed in courtrooms, "I would advise the men of this house to lay no hand on this lady, your grace, until they have heard what I have come to read. My name is Josiah Calloway. I am, and my father before me was, solicitor to the late Mr. Crispin Aldworth, of Bath, and I am the executor of his will." He let the name land. "I see it means little to this company. It will mean a great deal before I have done. Mr. Crispin Aldworth was the gentleman who, near 40 years ago, bought this house, Thornleigh Court, in which you are all at this moment standing, outright, in fee simple, and permitted the family of the Duke of Harrowby to reside in it. I hold his will, and with the leave of the bridegroom, I should like to read the material clauses aloud. I think," he said, and here the old man permitted himself the smallest dryness, "that they bear directly upon the disposal of this house, and therefore upon the prospects of the marriage about to be celebrated in it. They should be heard. A man holding a true document in a room full of people who have just realized they do not know what it says, holds an authority that money cannot buy, and rank cannot lend. And old Mr. Calloway had it, and the room fell silent under it, and even the dowager, white-lipped, said nothing. And so, in the great, frost-bright drawing room of Thornleigh Court, before 240 of the county's best, before the Dowager Duchess and the discarded bride, and the proud Duke in his wedding clothes, the solicitor opened the rosewood box and broke at last the black wax seal that an old man had pressed 11 years before, and read aloud the will of Crispin Aldworth, the great fortune left to the lawful issue of my son, George Aldworth, and to no other person whatsoever. And the freehold of Thornleigh Court, the house, the park, the gardens, the home farm, every brick and acre, left to the same heir, the Vanes holding it only for the life of the present Dowager Duchess, and not one day beyond. And at the foot, in the old man's own hand, the one human line, read out slow and clear into the appalled and silent room. And I charge my heir to be a kinder master of that house than I was a father in it. He folded the will, he set it down, and into the ringing silence, he said, simply, the lawful issue of George Aldworth, the sole heir named in this will, the owner in strict law of this house, since the hour her grandfather died 11 years ago, stands beside me. Her name is Marian Aldworth. I have here her parents' marriage lines, the entry in the register of St. Swithin at Walcott, her certificate of baptism, and a living witness to the marriage and the birth. Mrs. Burnett, your own housekeeper, who has held her peace these many years and will hold it no longer. The case is complete. It will be upheld in any court in England. He turned and looked at the dowager and at the Duke, and his old dry voice did not rise, and did not need to. You have, all of you, for the past 11 years, been the guests of this lady, and you turned her out of her own front door, into the rain, on a lie, 6 weeks ago. I thought the company should know it. What followed, Marian watched from a great calm distance, as though from the far side of a window. She watched the color drain from the dowager's handsome face, and the outrage curdle into something older and more frightened, the look of a woman who has built her whole self upon a house, and has just been told the house was never hers. She watched Miss Lavinia Croft turn from white satin to white face in the space of a sentence, as she understood, for even Miss Croft was clever enough to understand this, that the man she was minutes from marrying was not the rich duke she had been sold, but a debtor in a borrowed house, and that the £80,000 her father had laid down had bought a coronet, a mountain of mortgages, and a home that belonged to the gray companion she had called a thief. And she watched Mr. Croft, the banker, who had not made a great fortune by being slow, lean, and murmur something hard and urgent in his daughter's ear. And so the marriage of the Duke of Harrowby died quietly, then and there, on its own wedding morning, without a blow struck, killed by a sheet of cream paper and a disk of black wax. And she watched the Duke. This was the thing she had not been able to plan for, and the thing she would remember longest. She had braced herself for his anger, or his denial, or the cold, flat contempt he had shown her over the garnet ring. She had not braced herself for what she saw, because she had not known it was in him to feel. He heard the will read out, and watched his bride's face close against him, and his mother's authority crumble, and his whole carefully arranged rescue collapse into ruin. And he did not, in that first long moment, look at any of it. He looked at Marian, at the gray woman he had forgotten twice, and laughed at by his silence, and called a thief, and put out in the rain, standing now in the doorway of her own house, with her chin level, and the brass key at her throat. And she saw across his handsome face the whole anatomy of a man's world ending, the disbelief, the dawning understanding, and then the part she had not expected, not fury and not self-pity, but a deep, white, unmistakable shame. He understood at once, and completely, and better than anyone else in the room, the exact size of what he had done. And he did not look away from it, and he did not look away from her. The room dissolved into noise, the dowager's voice rising, Mr. Croft's flatbanker's tones cutting under it, the murmur of 240 people discovering they had a story to tell for the rest of their lives. But the Duke of Harrowby walked out of the wreck of his wedding, straight down the length of the room toward Marian, and stopped before her, and did a thing that no one in that room had ever seen a duke do, and that the dowager made a small, strangled sound to see. He bowed to her, not the slight inclination of a host to a guest, but low and full, the bow a man makes to one of far greater consequence than himself, the bow Mr. Calloway had made her in his office, but from a duke, in his own ruined wedding, before the whole county. And he straightened, and looked at her, and said, in a voice stripped bare of the cold certainty she had heard from him for 2 months, low and rough, and meant for her, and not the room, "I forgot your name. I forgot it on purpose, because I had decided you were no one. And it was easier to forget no one than to wonder why no one read Greek and curtsied like a queen. Marian Aldworth, I shall not forget it again as long as I live." He drew a breath that was not quite steady. "I have wronged you past any apology a man can make in a sentence, and I shall not insult you by trying. But I am standing in your house, having put you out of it into the rain, and I find I would rather hear you order me out of it with your own voice than be spared the hearing of it. Will you not say it? You have the right. It is, every brick of it, yours." And Marian Aldworth looked at him, at the proud man unmade, bowing in the ruins of his own wedding in a house he had just learned was hers, offering her, in the only coin he had left, the right to cast him out as he had cast her. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not want it. She had thought, on the long cold coach from Bath, that she wanted that very thing, to stand in this room and say, "Get your things and get out," and watch it land on him as it had landed on her, and call it justice. But standing in it now, with the truth told, and her name restored, she found the wanting had gone out of her, the way the hardness had gone out of an old man dying in Bath. And what was left was not forgiveness, for it was far too soon for that, but something cooler and clearer, and entirely her own. She would not be made cruel by the cruelty done to her. That, she understood now, was the last thing they could take, and she would not give it. "No, your grace," she said, and her low, clear voice carried through the listening room. "I shall not order you out into the rain. I am not what you took me for, and I find I am also not what you have just given me leave to be." She paused, and her gray eyes did not waver. "This house is mine. The law and my grandfather have said so, and I shall not pretend otherwise to spare anyone's feelings, least of all yours. Your mother holds it for her life, and she may finish her life in it, in peace, for I will not turn an old woman out of her home as I was turned out of mine. I am her landlord now, not her enemy, and she will find, I think, that there is a difference between the two." A small sound came from the dowager. Marian did not turn. "As for you, your grace, you owe me no house, for the house was always mine, and never yours to owe. You owe me nothing that money can pay, and I will take nothing from you that money can pay. But you have learned today, before all these people, exactly what you are, and exactly what I am, and exactly what you did to me when you thought I was no one. That is the only payment I require of you, and you have made it in full just now, with that bow. Keep it. Remember it. Be hereafter the kind of man who does not need a sealed will to tell him that a woman who reads Greek and curtsies like a queen and bears every cruelty without a tear might be worth the trouble of remembering. That is all I ask. It is a great deal more than you asked of me." And then she turned to the room, to the 240, to the white-faced dowager, and the ruined bride, and the murmuring county. and she made them a curtsy. It was the same curtsy she had made the night they laughed at her, deep and exact, and entirely without servility, the curtsy of a woman taught by people who had been received at court. But this time, when she rose from it with her chin level and her eyes dry, not one soul in that great frost-bright room laughed, and into the absolute silence of 240 people who had laughed at her once and would never dare laugh again, Marian Aldworth, mistress of Thornleigh Court, turned with her solicitor at her side and the brass key at her throat, and walked the length of her own drawing room and out through the great doors with a straight back. And this time, it was not the cold rain that waited for her on the gravel sweep, but the hard, bright winter sun. She did not take the Duke that day, nor for a long while after. The channel of this story does not run so cheap as that, and neither did Marian Aldworth. A beau in the ruins of a wedding is not atonement. It is only the first honest thing a man has done. She went back to Bath with Mr. Calloway, and her identity was proved within the week, exactly as he had promised. The marriage lines and the baptism and Mrs. Burnett's sworn word laid before the proper authorities and accepted without a quibble, and the great fortune of Crispin Aldworth came into the hands of his granddaughter, who had owned a writing box, a brass key, a soft-folded letter, and £3 sewn into the lining of a travel case. She paid back the £5 she had borrowed of Mrs. Burnett's sister, and then she did a great deal more than that. She took Mrs. Tilly Burnett out of service and gave her a cottage of her own and a pension for life, and told her, holding both the housekeeper's hands, that the running down the drive in the rain had been the bravest thing anyone had ever done for her, and that she would not forget it as long as she lived. And Mrs. Burnett wept at last the tears she had held through 11 years of holding her tongue, and refolded a handkerchief that did not need it, twice, and said it was nothing. It was only what Mary Hale's daughter was owed. The Dowager Duchess of Harrowby lived out her life at Thornleigh Court, as Marian had said she should, in the rooms that were hers for her lifetime, never turned out and never made to feel her dependence, though she felt it keenly enough on her own account, and it was a strange and not unjust thing that the old woman who had worked her companion like a drudge should pass her last years as the tenant for life of that same companion. She never apologized. She had not the largeness for it. But once, a year before she died, she asked Marian to read to her of an evening, of the old habit, and Marian came and read in the low, educated voice that had carried up and down those marble stairs for years. And at the end, the Dowager said, not looking at her, "You read very well. You always did. I knew, I think, from the first, that you were not what we said. I chose not to know it. That was my doing, and I shall answer for it where such things are answered for. It was not an apology, but from Augusta Vane, it was very nearly one. And Marian, who had learned to value the truth above all coins, accepted it as the small true thing it was, and went on reading, and let the old woman keep her dignity in the house they both now knew had never been her own. Miss Lavinia Croft did not become a duchess. The marriage, killed on its wedding morning, was never revived. Mr. Croft the banker, who understood a bad investment when a sealed will read it out to him, took his daughter and his £80,000 back to Bristol within the fortnight, and within the year had married Lavinia, at a comfortable distance from the county that had watched her humiliation, to a wealthy shipowner who knew nothing of garnet rings tucked into the linings of travel cases. The ring was never spoken of between them again, for there was no need. Every soul in the county knew now who had been the thief and who the wronged, and Miss Croft carried that knowledge with her like a stone in a shoe for the rest of her glossy life, which was a punishment Marian had not lifted a finger to inflict, and did not, in the end, begrudge her. And the Duke of Harrowby earned her. That was the slow heart of the rest of the story, and it was not quick, and it was not cheap, and Marian made certain of both. He had lost his easy certainty forever on his own wedding morning, and a good thing too, and he courted her, When at last, after a proper interval, he dared begin, the way a man courts who knows himself the suitor of his betters, and the debtor of his beloved, slowly, humbly, with deeds, and not words. He could not pay her in money, and she would take none. So he paid her in the only currency she had ever valued, the steady, costly, unglamorous proof of a changed man. With the honest help of his sister Lady Harriet, he set about the long unsweetening of the wrongs his family had done. For once, a proud man has been made to see one wrong. He begins, if there is anything in him, to see the rest. He found the underservants his steward Mr. Pruitt had cheated, and made them whole, and turned Mr. Pruitt off without a character, which Marian observed with a dry private satisfaction she did not trouble to hide. He sold what an honorable man may sell to pay down the mortgages on Harrowby Hall. Lived smaller, did not marry money, and let it be known in the county that the Duke of Harrowby would mend his house with his own economy, or not at all. And he came to Thornleigh, to her house, now, openly her house, not as a master, but as a caller, hat in hand, and he sat where he was bidden, and learned slowly to talk to her as one person talks to another, which he had never in his life had to do with anyone, and Marian watched him learn it, and was not in a hurry, and let the seasons turn. He read to her once, of an evening, having asked leave first, and made a great hash of the Greek, and laughed at himself for it with none of the old pride. And she thought that a man who can laugh at himself over a botched line of Greek in the house he was thrown out of has traveled a very great distance from the cold figure who said, I never trusted the look of you. And she found, somewhere in that winter and the spring that followed, that the splinter he had left in her, for he had left one in her too, that day in the library, though she had buried it deep, had begun, very slowly, to work its way toward something else. It was a full year and more before she let him speak. And when he did, it was not in a ballroom or drawing room before any company, but in the walled garden at Thornleigh, on a still, gray afternoon, with the first snowdrops coming up through the cold earth. And he did not make a speech. He said, simply, standing before her with his hat in his hands, like the farmer he had once cheated and made whole, I have nothing to offer you that you do not already have, and more of it. I cannot raise you, for you are above me, and we both know it, and the county knows it, and the law that gave you this house knows it. I can only tell you that I am a different man than the one who wronged you, and that you made me so, not by your fortune, but by your forbearance, by not ordering me out into the rain when you had every right, and by making me stand in what I had done, until I understood it. I do not ask you to forget. I ask only whether, knowing the worst of me, and having seen the best of what I have been able to become, you could ever consent to share with me the house that is yours, not as my duchess, for I have nothing to make you, but as my equal, and my better, and the woman who taught a proud fool what he was. And he closed his mouth and waited, with no certainty at all, the way she had once waited at the foot of his staircase for her wages. And Marian Aldworth, mistress of Thornleigh Court, looked at the changed man standing hat in hand among the snowdrops in her own garden, and she closed her hand, once, around the brass key at her throat. Her mother's key, the thing they could not take, the truth of who she was. And she heard her mother's voice, not in grief this time, but in something like a blessing. A straight back cost nothing. She had kept her back straight through all of it, through the shawl and the wages and the laughter and the rain, and it had brought her here, to a garden that was hers, with a man who had earned, slowly and at cost, the right to ask. And she found that her answer, when she gave it, was given freely, by a woman who chose, and not by a companion who had no choices left. I did not want vengeance, she said, and I find I do not want a duke either, your grace, for I have no need of one, and never did. But I find, and here, for the first time in the whole long winter of him, she let him see her smile, slow and real and entirely her own, that I should not mind a man who reads Greek so very badly, and who has learned to laugh at himself for it, And who knows the worth of a thing he once threw out into the rain? You may call again. We shall see. I make no promises, save one, that I shall always tell you the truth, even when it falls on you like a roof coming in. You have had a great deal of that from me, and it seems to have done you good." And the Duke of Harrowby, who had learned at last that this was the most that an honest woman could promise, and the most that a wise man should ever want, bowed to her again among the snowdrops, low and full and glad, and accepted it as the great gift it was. They married in the end the following autumn, in the little church at Walcott, where her mother and father had married in the rain 40 years before, with the same register on the same table, and Marian's married name written into it in her own hand, beneath, at last, the long faded ink of Mary Hale and George Aldworth. There was no great company, and no £80,000 in diamonds, and no county craning to see, only Mrs. Burnett, weeping and refolding her handkerchief, and Lady Harriet, plain and glad, and old Mr. Calloway in his best coat, who had brought the register himself, and wept, in his dry way, polishing his gold spectacles, when he saw the daughter's name written under the mother's. And Marian wore no jewels, but the small brass key on its faded blue ribbon, which she would wear to her own death, and leave one day to a daughter of her own, with the same words her mother had given her: "Keep the key. Whatever else goes. There is a thing it opens that they cannot take." And so the brass key came home. Years afterward, for this story does not end at the altar, the way the cheap ones do, but goes on into the long, quiet life the altar only begins. Marian, Duchess of Harrowby, and mistress in her own right of Thornleigh Court, sat of an evening in the great library of the house she had once been forbidden to read in the warm gold light of the candles, her husband across the hearth, reading badly aloud from a Greek he had never mastered and never stopped trying, and their first child asleep upstairs in the blue room under the eaves that had once been the coldest room in the house, and was now the warmest, kept always with a good fire. On the table beside her stood the rosewood writing box, no longer empty, with its twin from Bath set beside it. The two boxes reunited that an old, hard, sorry man had made by one hand, and parted in his pride. And around her throat, warm against the slate-gray silk she still favored over any jewel, hung the small brass key on its faded blue ribbon. The key she had kept when everything else was sold, that she had pressed to her throat at the foot of a staircase, asking for wages, and in the rain on the night she was cast out, and in a bath office on the evening her name was given back to her. She lifted it now, in the candlelight, and closed her hand around it. Once, the old gesture, no longer the bracing of a woman about to be brave, but the quiet salute of a woman who had been. And the rosemary her grandfather had laid in the box for a grandchild he never met lay pressed and brown and whole between the pages of the family Bible. Rosemary, for remembrance. And outside the tall windows, the Thornleigh Park lay dark and still, and entirely her own. She thought of her mother, dying in the small hot room that smelled of camphor and failure, pressing this same key into a frightened girl's hand with the last of her strength. There is a thing it opens that they cannot take. She had not meant the box. Marian had understood that at last in a cottage in the rain. She had meant this. Not the house, not the fortune, not even the name, though all of those had come, but the straight back, and the dry eyes, and the truth held close through every cruelty until the cruelty exhausted itself, and the truth still stood. They had taken everything they could reach, and they had never, not for 1 hour, been able to reach the thing the small brass key truly opened, which was simply, and entirely, herself. She set the key back against her throat, and let the candle gutter low, and she did not weep, and she was not triumphant. She was only, at the last, at her own hearth, in her own house, with her name her own, and her heart her own, and her back as straight as her mother had taught her. Home. The key lay warm in the hollow of her throat. She left it there. She would always leave it there. That was tonight's chapter from Candlelit Chapters. If her story moved you, snuff the candle gently and join me for the next.